Hi, I'm Aislinn Antrim with Pharmacy Times. Today I'm speaking with Michael Haydock, Senior Director of Cardiovascular, Metabolic, and Infectious Diseases Content at Informa Pharma Intelligence about the latest updates on COVID-19 vaccines. So it's been a few months since we last spoke, and a lot has happened over the last few months. We now have vaccines in the US from Pfizer and BioNTech, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. Although the Johnson & Johnson vaccines have been paused just as of this morning. Can you give me a basic review of kind of where we're at?
Yeah, sure. So the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that you mentioned, they're both mRNA-based vaccine candidates. They were the first two to the market at the end of last year. They're highly effective, no safety issues so far, which is really good. So they're both around 95% effective or so against symptomatic COVID, which is COVID of any severity, and also very effective against hospitalizations and death as well. So overall, very positive. The only slight downside to the Pfizer one in particular at the moment is it requires ultra cold storage, and that had some initial hurdles with regards to rollout. You have to basically keep it at very low temperatures, which more rural pharmacies, for example, can't do. However, they are working on making that more accessible and storing it at more refrigerator-like temperatures. As you mentioned, we then saw the Johnson & Johnson vaccine gain emergency use approval last month. That has a slightly different technology. It uses a viral vector that effectively carries the gene for the spike protein of coronavirus, and means that your cells then express that gene, they express the protein, and then you build up immunity against that protein. So it works in a slightly different way, but the key advantage of that is that it's a single dose vaccine, whereas the others are 2-dose.
Definitely. Just this morning, the CDC and the FDA have paused use of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of concerns around some rare blood clot issues. Can you discuss what those concerns are and kind of what's being done about them?
Sure. So it sounds like a very similar story. I'm sure you're aware AstraZeneca's vaccine has also had its issues here in the EU. It's not yet approved in the US, but similar issues. We don't yet know if it is a true link. So at the moment, both the US and the EU regulators have said it's a possible link with these blood clots. So the issue seems to be, at least with the AstraZeneca one, and I assume it's similar for the Johnson & Johnson one, with a very rare type of blood clots called a CVST, or a cerebral venous sinus thromboembolism. And that also presents with low platelet counts. It's called thrombocytopenia. So it's extremely rare. We don't actually know yet whether, particularly for the Johnson & Johnson one, because it's so recent, we don't yet know if the rate of these events is actually higher than the background rate. But as a precaution, given what we've seen with the AstraZeneca vaccine, they've paused it for now so they can investigate it further. For the AstraZeneca one that I mentioned, it's a similar technology. It also uses an adenovirus vector, so it's effectively a very similar design to Johnson & Johnson's one. In the EU, they did a review last week, and they said the background rate for this CVST, which is a blood clot of interest, seems to be somewhere between 5 and 6.5 per million. So it's very, very rare. The problem is we don't really know what a good background estimate for just natural occurrence of this particular blood clot is. So the EMA, which is the European regulator, suggests it's somewhere between 2 and 5. So it's possible with AstraZeneca being 5 to 6, it might be slightly higher. But the EMA did actually say that 2 to 5 estimate is itself subject to a lot of uncertainty, because there have been some studies in the Netherlands and Australia where they said it was probably actually somewhere closer between 13 to 16 per million is what you'd naturally find. So both of the regulators have said it's a possible cause, but really we just have to wait till there's more data, and we might pick up more of these cases to see if it is a genuine safety signal.
Okay. I know with Johnson & Johnson in the US, having that single shot approach was kind of exciting. Hopefully would make it easier to get to some hard to reach populations. How could this pause potentially impact vaccination efforts across the country?
Yeah, it could really slow things down, which is a shame. It very much depends how the public respond to it. I mean, I would say at this point, just reiterate again, it is a potential safety issue. There's no suggestion that these rates are necessarily higher than what you see in the background. So for now, I'm personally very confident that these vaccines, the benefit they provide far outweighs the risk, particularly if you're elderly or if you've got particular comorbidities. I think most people will probably accept that the balance, the risk benefit is still okay. I think where it becomes more difficult is the younger adults who don't necessarily perceive themselves to be at risk anyway, because the data is suggesting coverage might be lower in them anyway, just because they don't see it as entirely necessary. And now if you add on the extra potential for a safety risk, that could be problematic. Similarly, when you're probably aware Pfizer have recently applied to get their vaccine approved for emergency use in 12 to 15-year-olds, and that's the general future direction of these vaccines, to expand their use into adolescents and children. And again, if there is that safety issue hanging over these, and I'm sure parents will be a bit wary of vaccinating children where the benefit arguably isn't very high anyway. So I'd say that's the main issue. It will slow down the, if you like, the younger population being vaccinated.
Good to know. Variants have become an increasingly talked about issue. Some notable ones in the UK and South Africa, and they're both all over the US now as well. What are you hearing about vaccine efficacy with these variants, and how could they impact vaccinations?
Yeah, the two main ones that have been largely spoken about are what's called the UK variant and the South African variant. The good news on the UK variant is that although it does seem to spread faster, so it seems to be more transmissible, the impact on vaccine efficacy doesn't seem to be that high at all. So we know from Novavax, which is another vaccine manufacturer, they did a trial in the UK, and I think overall their efficacy was around the 95% mark or so against just all COVID. If you looked at the UK variant specifically, I think it was around 86, 87%. So it doesn't seem to be a big impact on efficacy, which is promising because that seems to be the one that spreads faster. For the South African one, that one's more concerning, more problematic. Again, the positive side doesn't seem to spread as fast, or at least as well as the UK variant. It's certainly not the dominant variant in the US for now, but there is good evidence to show, both from Novavax and Johnson & Johnson studies, that vaccine efficacy is definitely lower against that variant. So I'm sure if that variant does spread, or indeed other variants emerge, as they inevitably will, then we're going to need to develop adjusted vaccines and possibly give booster doses.
Well, you kind of led into my next question. We've heard some discussion about future vaccines specifically designed to tackle these variants, or booster shots. Will those be necessary, or how do you predict that looking?
Yeah, I think they'll definitely be necessary. It's just a natural evolution of viruses, particularly RNA-based viruses, which is what coronavirus belongs to. They mutate very rapidly, and if you put a selective pressure on them, then evolution will do its job, and they'll find the ways of mutating to try and escape the immune system and the pressures that you put on them. So it's inevitable. You can reduce the risk by trying to suppress this transmission of the virus in your community. So the lower case rates are, the less likely it is that you generate them. But I think over time it will happen naturally. We see it with flu, for example. It's another RNA-based virus. Every season we see new variants emerging. So I'm sure it will happen. In terms of how it looks for vaccinations, as I say, we'd need to develop for the ones that are able, for the new variants that are able to escape existing immune responses elicited by the first generation vaccines, you need to generate booster doses. It's quite easy to do. It will probably take, I think the company started earlier this year, maybe around mid this year, around summer, we should have the first new formulations of the vaccines available. So it's reasonably easy to do. The question, of course, is we don't know, particularly in the US, where the what's called genotypic testing, so sequencing of these viruses, isn't actually performed that well. The CDC is trying to ramp it up very quickly, but the problem that the US faces is we don't actually know how prevalent these variants are because we're not testing for them very well. So if these variants do become more widely circulated, then of course that's a problem, because the pharma companies need to decide when and in which countries do they switch their vaccine production to the newer variants, because you obviously don't want to be producing a lot of vaccine that's no longer effective. So you need to have good epidemiology data, and that's, I think, the challenge, to understand actually how widespread these variants are.
It'll be interesting to see. I just recently saw some experts expressing concerns that the UK variant specifically, as you mentioned, could impact younger adults differently and lead to a new potential surge. Is there any data on this issue? What are you seeing with rates and affecting younger adults?
Yeah, I'd say there's certainly been an increase in the number of young adults who are being hospitalized. I guess the problem with saying whether the rate is increased is that might just be because it's more transmissible, there's more people infected and therefore more people presenting. So we don't necessarily, I haven't seen hard data at this point to say the rate is necessarily higher. As I say, it's a minor concern, I would say, because we know for now, at least, the vaccines are still effective against the UK variant. So I'm not too concerned about a particular surge in that. I guess the risk, as I mentioned before, is that if, generally speaking, you have a higher amount of circulating virus and more cases, then you give it more opportunities, more rolls of the dice, if you like, to generate more variants. So that's the problem. I think you really want to be trying to keep transmission as low as possible to reduce your risk of generating new variants.
Definitely. Circling back just a little bit to the AstraZeneca vaccine, as you said, not approved in the US yet, but has similar concerns as what we're seeing with Johnson & Johnson. How could those concerns impact a potential FDA emergency use authorization?
Yeah, I think AstraZeneca, as far as I'm aware, hasn't actually applied yet. They're expected to. In a way, I think it would be largely academic whether they did gain emergency use authorization or not. I think clinically, as I said at the start, the risk benefit of these vaccines is clearly positive, even if, let's say, this CVST was associated with the vaccine. It's very rare. And for most people, the benefit of getting vaccination will outweigh the risk. I would say that it's more the timing that I think is problematic for AstraZeneca, because the US is quite far along in its vaccination program. I believe most, if not all, states now have opened up vaccination to all adults, not just the elderly and the key risk groups. So that it's more of an academic question that even if it was approved, would anyone actually be willing to take it? My suspicion is probably not. I think most people would say, actually, I'm quite happy. Thank you very much. I'll wait for Moderna and Pfizer if I can get those. So even if it was approved, I don't think it would get a particularly high uptake in the US. So I think it's largely academic. But I think just clinically, it is justified to approve it. But, you know, practically, it's not going to be used much.
Gotcha. Well, finally, is there anything else you think people should be keeping an eye on as the pandemic and these rollouts continue?
I think, as I mentioned before, the interesting next step will be children and adolescents. And so far, we've only got data from Pfizer in 12 to 15-year-olds, which is really positive. So I expect we should start be able to vaccinating children around summer and before they get back to school, which will be really good. Moderna is also expecting some similar data in the next few weeks, which will be hopefully positive as well. So that would be nice, given those vaccines haven't been affected at the moment by these potential safety concerns. If we can get on vaccinating younger children and adolescents as well, I'm sure that would be a good next step.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This was great.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your time.